This video is brought to you by Blessed Be God Boutique, maker of Catholic fashionable apparel, handmade accessories, and more.
We return now to Malachi Martin and his, frankly, prophetic warnings about the state of the church. In the last installation of this, I talked about how he had been beating the drumbeat about the attempt to destroy papal primacy in the church, and had been doing so for many, many years, and I will return to that subject in due time. But today, I have a more prophetic warning from him. What we have now is what would happen to the church if the laity and the bishops and the priests got it into their head that the occupant of the throne of Peter was not a validly elevated pontiff, that he was an anti-pope. What would happen? When you understand the attempt to destroy papal primacy, to destroy the authority of the Roman pontiff, you see how this can become a dangerous combination. And we're living through that right now, because more and more Catholics are believing that Francis is not an actual pope, that he is an anti-pope. Those numbers are not going down, they're increasing every single day. So what you're about to hear is Malachi Martin, from one of the final chapters of The Keys of This Blood, warning people about the collapse of the Catholic Church as we know it. The overall deterioration of the Roman Catholic institutional structure has now gone so far, indeed with each passing year proceeds at such a sustained pace, and Pope John Paul II and his papal bureaucracy have been pushed or have retreated into such ineffectual isolation from the day-to-day governance of the Church Universal that now three dreadful outcomes are possible. Any of them could, probably would, entail the final disintegration of this Roman Catholic institutional organization as we have known it, and as men and women have known it for over 500 years. The day that a sizable body of Roman Catholics, clergy and laity, become convinced, rightly or wrongly, that the then occupant of the apostolic throne of Peter is not, perhaps never was, a validly elected pope, that day the presently continuous piece-by-piece deterioration of the organizational structure will be quickened into a muffled collapse of the entire organization. The already schism-split and heresy-ridden Roman Catholic body will then be a headless thing, a complicated machine exploding in all directions into fragments, because its secure casing and capstone cover were shattered. For the only tangible guarantee Roman Catholics have that a man has truly become pope is the legal guarantee of valid elevation in a legal conclave of legal cardinals. Their faith then assures them that through this man and his predecessors, they are in historical relationship with Jesus Christ, who founded the Church, and in supernatural relationship with Christ as he now is in the heaven of God's glory. The legality or validity, to use the ecclesiastical term, of a papal elevation depends on the exact observance, in the presence of witnesses, of the various visible and controllable procedures laid down in the rules for papal conclaves. The final outcome of the conclave, a validly elevated pope, is attained only with the freely pronounced accepto of the pope-elect. This is why Cardinal Laurenti, who became pope-elect at the conclave of February 1922, could never be regarded as pope. He did freely decline to accept the pontificate, having been validly chosen by the due majority. No one has to accept the Petrine office. A pope-elect who refuses to accept it is not obliged to explain why he has refused it, just as a pope who resigns the office is not obliged to explain why he has resigned. What does the term freely mean when we say that the pope-elect must freely accept or reject his being chosen to the pontificate? Take, for example, the conclave of 1903, which produced as Pope Pius X Giuseppe Melchior Cardinal Sarto. But Sarto was not the prime choice of those 62 cardinal electors. After one voting session and scrutiny of the votes, on August 1st, the first day of the conclave, it was clear that the required majority, 29 in this instance, Sarto only got 5 votes in that session, went to Italian-born Mariano Cardinal Rampolla del Tindaro. Rampolla, if allowed, would have pronounced the required accepto, would therefore have become pope automatically. But he was not allowed to accept the pontificate. At the time, Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria had the privilege from the Vatican of vetoing any pope-elect he did not fancy. Rampolla he did not fancy, but the majority of cardinal electors never found out in their lifetime why it was so. The ostensible reason given for the emperor's veto was Rampolla's record of political opposition to Austria and his support of France. So on August 2nd, the Polish-born Jan Cardinal Puznia of Austria-Hungary stood up in the conclave and announced the emperor's veto on Rampolla. Rampolla and the other cardinal electors bowed to the Austrian veto because he and all the cardinals knew exactly what damage the persnickety Franz Josef could cause the churchmen in Central Europe, where the domains of the Austro-Hungarian Empire stretched. In that sense, Rampolla's non-accepto was free. He and the other cardinals freely accepted the existence of that veto. But insofar as the emperor's veto impeded the cardinals having the pope they freely chose, and impeded Rampolla from accepting to their overwhelming wish, neither they nor he was free. Yet no one then or since would hold that Rampolla was the real pope, that Sarto, the pope-elect, produced by a later session of voting and scrutiny, was not validly pope. It was only in subsequent years that the true motive for Franz Josef's veto was revealed. The emperor was privy to a very closely held secret. Cardinal Rampolla had joined the House of the Stonecutters. Without any doubt, the emperor had the right to veto a papal candidate he did not fancy. Rampolla and the electors bowed to the exercise of that privilege, but an entirely different situation would arise if a pope-elect were prevented from accepting the papacy by someone who had no right to do so, someone who threatened ruin and death to a pope-elect's reputation and family and person if he accepted his election as pope. Such a thing would be unjust and would be an undue limitation on the freedom of the cardinal electors. In that instance, the pope-elect would be in no way free. Unjust force and pressure would rob him of his freedom and would rob the church of its validly elected pope. But very hard questions can thus arise. Nowadays, for instance, there is no state power or individual to whom the Holy See has granted a formal veto power on popes elect. There is, however, a different category of persons outside the conclave that the Holy See recognizes as having a legitimate interest in the actual identity of the new pope. The cardinal electors entering a conclave today are aware of which papal candidate is persona non grata to which interested outside party. Veto it is not, in the old formal sense, yet the likes and dislikes of such parties are certainly taken into account. And therefore, at least theoretically, the situation can arise in which a duly elected candidate for the pontificate is vetoed. In such a case, and it is not as theoretical as it would sound, very puzzling questions would emerge concerning the election of a second pope-elect in the same conclave. Those questionings could blossom into a persuasion that the second conclave was invalid, that indeed the freedom of the electors had been unduly manacled, and that the church has been hoodwinked, and that the valid pope-elect had been sidetracked. If such a persuasion were shared by a sizable body of Roman Catholics, the consequences could be dire for church unity. The same catastrophe of disintegration would desolate the Roman Catholic institutional organization. This is the second dreadful possibility. If a sizable body of Roman Catholic clergy and laity became convinced, rightly or wrongly, that the then occupant of the throne of Peter was elected quite validly, but over time had become heretical and was actually collaborating, actively or passively, in the piece-by-piece dismemberment of the sacred Petrine office and its ministerial organization, for a pope who became a heretic would cease to be pope. In such a situation, the principal cause of disintegration would be the lack of any authoritative voice in the church structure by which Catholics would be assured authoritatively that their pope had or had not fallen into heresy. For there is no official mechanism within the structure of the church that is authorized to pass judgment on pope and papacy. Indeed, the church's official code of ecclesiastical law, canon law, expressly denies to anyone the right or duty of passing official judgment on pope or papacy. Only once so far in this century did a situation arise when a pope, Paul VI, did contemplate and take the first steps taking a course of action that some of his closest advisors through the world would have entailed certain heresy. This arose because of the way in which Pope Paul VI originally proposed to change the age-old and all-important ceremony of the Roman Mass. His first version of a new Mass ceremony, those advisors argued, if it ever had been imposed and enforced throughout the Church Universal, would effectively have done away with those elements of the ceremony that were, and still today are dogmatically essential to the successful confection of the sacrifice of Jesus Christ on the cross of his death. At least two cardinals, Ottaviani and Bacci, made it clear privately to Pope Paul VI and publicly to third parties that if he went ahead with his plans for the new Mass ceremony, they would not hesitate to denounce him publicly to the whole Church as a heretic and as deposed from the throne of Peter. They were prepared to denounce his new Mass ceremony as reeking of heresy. The faithful would thereby have been released from all allegiance and obedience to Pope Paul VI. He would have ceased to be pope. In the event, Pope Paul, under such a dire threat from two prestigious cardinals, retreated from his original proposal, and the Church was spared a harrowing experience. But it is to be noted that neither Ottaviani nor Bacci nor any of the other churchmen involved had any juridical right to make the threat or to carry it out. The mere threat frightened Paul VI into retreat. by modifying his first version of the new Mass in order to eliminate the most glaringly offensive elements of his original text, and by the counter-threatening Cardinal Ottaviani with deprivation of the sacraments. He escaped official censure at the hands of his Vatican colleagues. That 1967 crisis was kept under Vatican wraps. Thus, a great searing and divisive rift could split church members, some siding with the Pope, others declaring him invalidated by his alleged heresy. Inevitably, at least two church bodies would emerge, each contesting the other, each claiming to be orthodox. Whether an attempt to elect a new and supposedly orthodox pope would be made by those who believe the original pope to be heretical, or whether solid arguments of the Catholic body would detach themselves from obedience to the accused pope, the effect, disintegration, would be a wholesale loss of faith in the papacy, resulting in abandonment of Catholic religious practice and observance of Catholic moral precepts, which would be followed by the adoption of the cafeteria religion John Paul II derided, the pick-and-choose Catholicism of many millions of Catholics today in North America and throughout the Western world. And that was Malachi Martin warning us from the late 1980s, hence the references to John Paul II, about what would happen if there was a heretic pope on the throne of Peter. Does it sound familiar to you? It should, especially since now we have a time where some high-profile bishops and cardinals are calling Francis, or at least hinting at him being a heretic, with one archbishop famously accusing him of such and having been accused of schism by people who should know better. Go back and look at the case of Pope Paul VI and Cardinal Ottaviani, and you see why that's a mistaken notion, at least in my mind. But I'm curious what you think about this. Do you think Malachi Martin's words resonate today, 35 years after he wrote them originally? Let me know in the comments, please. Like and subscribe if you haven't, it does help. So to sharing this on social media, that helps too. And as always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.